She didn't confess. She never does. He found out the way most men find out, not through confrontation, not through evidence. Through a feeling he'd been ignoring for months. A shift so small, so gradual, that by the time he was certain, part of him had already known for a long time. And he'd done nothing. That's the part that actually destroys a man. Not the act itself. The realization that he saw it coming and chose not to look. Rome had a name for that choice. And it wasn't forgiveness. In ancient Rome, the moment a husband discovered his wife's infidelity, a clock started. Not a metaphorical clock. A legal one. Under the Lex Iulia de adulteriis, Augustus's adultery law, 18 BC, a husband had 60 days to file charges after a divorce. 60 days. After that, the window closed. And if he didn't divorce her, if he stayed, absorbed it, kept quiet, he could be charged himself. The crime had a name, lenocinium. Pimping his own wife. Think about what it takes to build a society where tolerance of betrayal is a prosecutable offense. Where a man's silence in the face of his own humiliation is treated not as private grief, but as public crime. Rome wasn't being cruel. Rome was being precise. But here's what gets buried in the history books. Most men didn't prosecute. Why? Because the trial was public. Every detail read aloud. Her name. His name. The other man's name. Witnesses. Letters. In a culture built on reputation, where dignitas was currency, dragging it into court meant destroying whatever remained of the family's standing. So most men did what men across every era tend to do. They managed it quietly. Took the divorce. Moved on. On the outside. The inside is a different story. And Rome knew that too, which is exactly why they built a system that tried to force the outside to match. Stop for a second. Because this isn't just Roman history. The psychological mechanism at work here is the same one operating in any man, in any century, who discovers something he cannot immediately process. Betrayal doesn't hit all at once. It hits in layers. First, shock. Then, a strange kind of calm, almost dissociation. Then, weeks later, in the middle of something completely unrelated, the full weight of it lands. That delayed detonation is why so many men make their worst decisions, either too fast or far too late. The Romans tried to legislate around that delay. Force action. Remove the option of infinite processing. Did it work? That depends entirely on what you think the goal was. Here's what the history rarely asks. What was she doing before he found out? Not morally. Psychologically. Roman women occupied a world with almost no formal autonomy. A woman of the senatorial class couldn't own property independently, couldn't conduct business, couldn't appear in court. Her identity was built on and through the men around her, father, husband, sons. In a structure like that, transgression carries a specific emotional weight. It isn't just desire. It's often the only domain where she holds a secret the world can't access. Where she decides. Where she chooses. That doesn't make it right. But understanding the mechanism, clearly, without sentimentality, is the difference between a man who learns something and a man who just suffers something. Now look at the husband. Roman men were formed, deliberately, systematically, around the concept of gravitas. Weight. Composure. The projection of control at all times. It was admired. It was necessary. It was also a trap. A man trained to never visibly lose control is a man who has learned to suppress his own internal signals. He stops noticing emotional temperature in the room. He confuses silence for loyalty. Distance for respect. He builds. He provides. He assumes that the structure he's created is solid, because solid things are what capable men produce. And somewhere in that assumption, a gap opens. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Slowly. Quietly. Slowly. Quietly. In the space between two people who stopped being honest with each other. He didn't lose her the night he found out. He lost her in 100 small moments he didn't register as significant. That is the thing Rome couldn't legislate. You can pass a law about what happens after. You cannot pass a law that makes a man see what he doesn't want to see. This kind of content, grounded in history, honest about psychology, made for men who can handle complexity without needing it softened, is rare. If you've stayed this far, you already know that. Stay close. Back to Rome. After the divorce was filed, the husband could pursue criminal prosecution against both his wife and her partner. The penalties were severe. Exile to a remote island, relegatio. Property seizure. Permanent social exclusion. Ovid, writing around the same era, documented affairs with such casual familiarity that historians suspect the law was more symbolic than enforced for the upper classes. For senators and generals, reputation mattered more than punishment. The disgrace was the punishment. For ordinary men, it was more complicated. Messier. Less poetic. It always is. What Rome actually understood, and what gets lost in 2,000 years of retelling, is that a man's response to betrayal is not primarily about the woman. It's a statement about his relationship with himself. Not vengeance. Vengeance is just pain wearing a disguise. Not collapse. Collapse is just the ego refusing to survive without what it was attached to. Dignitas. That's the word they kept returning to. Not happiness. Not even justice. A man's core sense of his own worth, intact, untraded, not dependent on whether she chose him. That's not something you inherit. It's not something a law gives you. It gets built, and sometimes, it only gets tested when something tries to take it apart. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. If tomorrow you discovered the thing you've been half afraid to confirm, would you already know who you are on the other side of it? Or is that still something you'd have to figure out under pressure? Leave your answer below. The responses to that question tend to be more revealing than the question itself. And if this kind of thinking matters to you, stay close. What's coming next goes even deeper.